Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy McLeaf. I'm a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service at NCTC, and I'm excited to be partnering with the Monarch joint venture for the 2016 continuation of the Monarch Butterfly Conservation Series. So without further ado, I'd like to turn you over to Wendy Caldwell, who is the program coordinator for Monarch joint venture, and she will be introducing the presenter for today's broadcast.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Like Tracy said, I'm Wendy Caldwell, the coordinator of the Monarch joint venture, and we're happy to have you today and excited to bring you today's webinar, Conservation of Monarch Butterflies in the Western U.S., with presenter Sarina Jepsen from the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. Sarina directs the Xerces Society's Endangered Species Program, where she works on the conservation of monarch butterflies, bumblebees, freshwater mussels, and other at-risk invertebrate species. Since 2007, she's developed, implemented, and overseen many projects that address the conservation of monarchs in natal, migratory, and overwintering habitats of the western U.S. She's co-authored many publications about monarchs, including the report Conservation Status and Ecology of the Monarch Butterfly in the United States, and a book chapter, Understanding and Conserving the Western North American Monarch Population. She serves as the deputy chair of the IUCN Bumblebee Specialist Group, where she works with bumblebee experts to evaluate the conservation status of bumblebees worldwide. During today's webinar, if any questions come up during the presentation, I'm going to be monitoring the chat box where we encourage you to enter your questions. You do have to sign up for a live stream account in order to participate in the chat. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll have a short question and answer period where I will come back and revisit those questions with Sarina. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarina to start her presentation. Enjoy.
Thank you, Wendy. As Wendy mentioned, I work for the Xerces Society, and we are thank you. I work for the Xerces Society, and we're a science-based conservation organization that focuses on the preservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We began in the early 1970s, actually as a society of lepidopterists, focused on preventing the extinction of butterflies. And we're named after the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly, which is the first butterfly known to go extinct due to human activity. Our mission since the 70s has broadened quite a bit since then, and we now work to conserve a wide variety of invertebrates, including native bees, freshwater mussels, and other species. I currently direct endangered species and aquatic programs at the Xerces Society. We have 24 full-time employees across 2 of our programs working on the conservation of native pollinators, and within those 24 positions, 7 of us are working on monarch conservation. Our approach to conservation is to use applied research to inform habitat management, to engage citizen scientists in research and conservation, and we have 4 main areas of citizen science currently, including citizen science projects with monarchs in the western U.S. We advocate for policies that further invertebrate conservation. We provide training and technical guidance to land managers, restoration practitioners, and others, and we engage in habitat restoration. So today's talk will focus on monarch butterflies in the western U.S., and we've been working as an organization on western monarch conservation really since the 1980s. I'll talk today about monarch life history in the West and a little bit of biology, their conservation status, threats, and potential contributors to declines we've observed, as well as our conservation efforts and those of some of our partners in natal and migratory habitats of the West and conservation efforts in overwintering habitats. And then hopefully there will be some time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So we know from recent genetic studies that the eastern and western populations of the U.S. form a single panmictic population. Milkweed is distributed really broadly throughout the western U.S. and up to southern Canada. Here I can use this pointer. We have multiple generations in the western U.S. as we do in the eastern U.S. And we know that monarch butterflies overwinter in the west, both on the California coast, and we now know that some overwinter in Mexico as well. In the spring, monarchs are found in this area of the U.S., in the Pacific coastal states, as well as some of the southern states. And then into the early summer, monarchs are found more in the interior west, as well as in these coastal and southerly areas. And then the last generation of monarch butterflies in the late summer and early fall travels back to overwintering sites in California and in Mexico. We've got more than 35 species of milkweed in the western U.S., excluding subspecies. And we know that monarch caterpillars consume multiple western species of milkweed. We don't know a lot about larval preference for the various western milkweed species, although a few studies have been done to this end. Showy milkweed, or Asclepias speciosa, is our most broadly distributed species in the western U.S. And as I mentioned, we have multiple generations of monarchs per year, typically reaching the interior west in the early summer. As monarchs travel in the spring and summer looking for milkweed, they're also looking for nectar sources to fuel their migration. And we think that monarchs actually use river corridors as they migrate. So Hugh Dingle did a study with co-authors that was published in 2005 where they mapped monarch records from museum collections, and they found that the distribution of monarchs were associated with river corridors in this study. They also took those records and mapped them by calendar month, and this provides a really nice pictorial representation of where monarchs are during each season of the calendar year. We have some of the best information about monarch movements from tagging studies that have been done over many, many years. And this graphic is from a recent book chapter by Robert Michael Pyle that was published in Monarchs in a Changing World. And it depicts monarchs that were tagged in various locations. The dotted lines are the wild monarchs that were actually born in these locations and tagged here. And then at the end of the arrow is where those tagged monarchs were later recited and reported. And so this compilation of some tagging studies is really interesting because it demonstrates that monarchs move in multiple directions in the late summer. So we see monarchs moving in a south-southeasterly direction, in more of just a straight southerly direction in this case, and in a almost southwesterly direction. And further to that, some really great research out of the Southwest Monarch Study, an organization that Gail Morris directs in Arizona, has shown that monarchs tagged in Arizona actually overwinter in both Mexico and California at overwintering sites. So this is really contrary to sort of historic knowledge that suggested that all western monarchs overwinter in California. We now know they overwinter in both California coast as well as Mexican overwintering sites. We don't know the relative proportions of monarchs that are born in the West that go to California versus Mexico, or whether monarchs from western states other than Arizona travel to Mexico. But it's certainly really interesting and exciting research. At California overwintering sites, monarchs overwinter in clusters at forested groves on the California coast, and this figure here illustrates the locations of the known overwintering groves in California. The colored circles represent locations that have at one point in time hosted more than 1,000 monarch butterflies. And so while the overwintering groves are really distributed from across almost the entire state of California and into northern Baja, really the largest overwintering sites occur in the central part of the state along the coast from about the San Francisco Bay down to about Los Angeles. Adult monarchs arrive at overwintering sites in the fall, and then until about February, they overwinter in protected microhabitats that tree groves provide. And for the most part, monarchs are in reproductive diapause over the winter, although we do have some evidence that that there is some wintertime breeding that occurs on tropical milkweed in California. Most of the tree groves are dominated by exotic eucalyptus trees in California, most of the groves that monarchs use, although native conifers do make up a small proportion of many of the groves, and were probably much more prevalent historically, at least in the northern part of the state. And there's some recent research by Jessica Griffiths and Francis Villablanca from Cal Poly that demonstrated that monarch butterflies don't actually prefer eucalyptus trees over the native tree species. And in many cases, they're actually choosing native trees in a higher proportion than would be expected, given how few of them are at a site. At overwintering sites, monarchs have a pretty precise set of microclimatic requirements. They require protection from wind and storm, shelter from freezing temperatures, just the right amount of sunlight, of dappled sunlight, high humidity, and monarch overwintering sites are associated with water sources generally, as well as nectar sources, so plants that are blooming in the fall and winter time that monarchs can get nectar from. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about what we know about the conservation status of western monarchs. And before I really talk about this, I'd like to just discuss the scale of the California overwintering population relative to the Mexican population. So monarch populations are estimated in two locations really in full each year. There's a lot of breeding or a lot of monitoring that happens throughout the monarch's breeding range, but to get a full census of the monarch population, the populations are counted annually in Mexico, where they're overwintering, as well as along the California coast, and those are close to full censuses of the populations, although in California not all of the sites are counted. In Mexico, the sort of highest population recorded since monitoring began is estimated to be nearly 1 billion monarchs. And in California, the number of monarchs that overwinter are really an order of magnitude lower. Our highest numbers recorded in California are just over 1 million monarchs. And through the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count, which is a citizen science effort that began in 1997 and is entirely done by volunteers and managed by Mia Monroe and the Xerces Society, we've seen a 39% decline in overwintering monarchs from the long-term average. And most of the population decline appears to have happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And, a common question is whether 1997 is just an aberrant year. And so to address this question, we've looked at our database of historic monarch population estimates to try to find population estimates at individual overwintering sites prior to 1997, so before this large-scale monitoring effort began. And we were able to come up with, find some counts that had occurred at individual sites prior to 1997 where the same methodology was used and where the counts were done at the same time of year. And we found that at 3 of the 4 sites for which information was available prior to 1997, the numbers recorded at those sites were actually higher than the estimates in the mid-90s. So this is at Elwood, Maine, which is a common site or a large site in Santa Barbara County. Our 1997 census for that site was about 20,000 monarchs, and in 1981, the estimate was about 120,000. Similarly, at a popular site in San Luis Obispo County, Morro Bay, we had about 30,000 monarchs in the late 1980s, and in the mid-1990s, there were far fewer monarchs recorded. Similar story for a smaller site in Marin County, Purple Gate, and at Natural Bridges State Park in Santa Cruz County, a really famous monarch overwintering site. 1997 is the highest monarch population estimate recorded, but we had a pretty high one in 1997. So we think that perhaps a decline may have already started before monitoring began in 1997, or before large-scale monitoring began in 1997. And I just want to compare this monitoring to the numbers that come out of Mexico each year. And I know we're all eagerly awaiting the announcement of the population census from this last winter in Mexico. So this is the graph from a year ago, but we've seen an 82% decline compared to the long-term average in Mexico, and that's compared to about a 39% decline in California compared to the long-term average. Last year, we worked with NatureServe to evaluate the extinction risk of the North American monarch butterfly using their standardized method and rank calculator, which takes into consideration range extent, population trends, threats, vulnerability, and other factors. And we found that the subspecies of monarchs that occurs broadly throughout North America, as well as the species that has colonized many islands and other locations, Danaus plexipus plexipus is T3, or vulnerable to extinction. Then we evaluated the overwintering populations separately. So we determined that the California overwintering population is imperiled or vulnerable, and the Mexican overwintering population is critically imperiled, or T1, which is like the highest threat ranking. And the reason for the discrepancy between the California overwintering population and the Mexican overwintering population in this analysis is the difference in the severity of the decline that's been documented at overwintering sites, and the fact that in Mexico, such a large proportion of the overall population overwinters in such a small area, whereas the overwintering sites are much more spread out in California. And so the fact that they're overwintering in such a small area in Mexico makes that population incredibly vulnerable to like a severe weather event, such as a severe storm or a severe cold event. Okay, now I'll shift gears to discuss why monarchs might be declining in the West. What factors might be contributing to the population declines observed at overwintering sites. And I want to say we really don't know why monarchs are declining in the western U.S. We know there are many factors at play, and many factors that are likely contributing. And I'll walk through each one of these possible culprits. But this is really in contrast to the eastern U.S., where monarch decline observed at overwintering sites in Mexico is strongly associated with milkweed habitat loss, due primarily to the increased use of the herbicide glyphosate on corn and soy. But in the western U.S., I think the story is less clear. We have anecdotal evidence that milkweed has been lost from some areas that monarchs historically used, such as the Columbia Basin and the Snake River Plain in Washington and Oregon and Idaho, respectively. And we know monarchs actually still use some of those areas quite extensively. We also have anecdotal reports that milkweed is actively eradicated on rangelands in the West, and rangelands make up quite a large proportion of our habitat and our land base in the western U.S. And that's due to either actual or perceived livestock toxicity issues. Also, across the U.S., there's really been an unprecedented scale of grassland and prairie conversion to cropland, as well as a pretty large reduction in the amount of land enrolled in the amount of private land enrolled in the conservation reserve program, and much of that's driven by a push to produce more corn for biofuels. Real estate and energy development is also an issue. By some sources, we're losing more than 5,000 acres of land to development. And herbicide use, as I mentioned, is strongly associated with the loss of milkweed from the upper Midwest, and herbicide use may also be contributing to monarch declines in the western U.S. We've seen a 20-fold increase in glyphosate use in the past 20 years on corn and soy crops, and we've seen increases in some areas where we suspect monarchs breed in the West as well. So this is just a map of glyphosate use that shows the number of pounds per square mile used across the country in 1992, and then I'll switch it to our most recent data that we have from the USGS, which is 2013, and you can see that in some areas of the western U.S., especially again this Columbia Basin and Snake River Plain, glyphosate use has increased. And glyphosate remains the most commonly used pesticide in California. Also, systemic insecticides and especially neonicotinoids are of increasing concern to a wide variety of insects, including monarch butterflies. So neonicotinoids have a systemic mode of action. When a plant or seed is treated, the compound is expressed in all parts of the plant, including the leaf tissue that a caterpillar might eat, the nectar that an adult butterfly or a bee would drink, as well as pollen in the case of bees. These photos, just to let you know, are from a massive bee kill that occurred with a legal application of a neonicotinoid in Oregon a few years ago on linden trees. Neonicotinoids persist for really long periods in plant, soil, and water bodies. We know they're highly toxic to bees, and we have some new research from the USDA by Pachinka and Lundgren published last year that suggests that their use might be playing a role in monarch declines as well, and they are used broadly across the U.S. Also, I think aerial applications of insecticides for mosquitoes are prevalent and widespread, and there may be non-target effects to monarchs from these applications. In the western U.S., drought severity has been associated with declining monarch populations in likely breeding areas. So a study by Stevens and Fry compared probable or identified probable breeding areas in the West and found an association with Western monarch Thanksgiving count numbers in areas where drought is most severe. And in years when they're most severe, California wintering numbers are lower. But certainly more research is needed in this area since we've experienced such a severe drought in the last few years, and this study is somewhat older. Monarchs also have a wide variety of pathogens, parasites, and predators, and the impact of natural enemies on monarch populations across the country, I think, is poorly understood, or at least on a broad scale. The most research or the most well-studied of the natural enemies is probably OE, which we know can have harmful effects on monarch butterflies. Research by Dara Satterfield from the University of Georgia has shown that winter breeding monarch populations along the Gulf Coast are more likely to be infected with OE than migratory monarchs, and those populations persist on non-native tropical milkweed that stays green throughout the winter, and so the monarchs are able to stay and breed instead of migrating, and where they perhaps build up disease, and the concern is that these resident populations may then spread disease to migratory butterflies as they come back and interact at shared flowers. The impact of winter breeding and tropical milkweed is currently being investigated in the western U.S., but we do know that some year-round breeding on tropical milkweed occurs in California. And then the last of the potential factors contributing to monarch, or possibly contributing to monarch declines, is impacts to overwintering habitats. And in California, we know that monarchs select the same areas to reside in the winter that people also like to live, and there's a lot of development pressure on coastal California. We've documented at least 30 sites that have been logged and replaced with housing developments, or where housing developments and other developments have been built quite close to overwintering sites, and those sites no longer support monarch butterflies. And then there's a number of additional sites that are no longer suitable for monarchs because the trees have become diseased and have senesced or are starting to senesce, and really without active management of monarch groves, I think we'll see a lot more overwintering habitat in California not able to support monarch butterflies. Okay, so now I'll switch. I'm about halfway through the presentation, and I'll switch and discuss the conservation efforts of the Xerces Society and some of our partners. So I'd like to address conservation projects in natal and migratory habitats of the western U.S., as well as overwintering habitat in California. And generally, our approach to monarch conservation has been to use applied research and citizen science to inform habitat management, also to develop some technical guidance that informs habitat management, and to directly enhance habitat in natal areas and overwintering areas. We generally have a poor understanding of where monarchs are breeding and what migratory pathways they're using in the western U.S., although certainly we have some clues. But identifying those areas is a key first step to conserving monarch butterflies. A couple of previous studies have revealed some broad regional patterns of monarch natal origins. So the first here is a study by Louis Yang that was published last year out of UC Davis, and he used a stable isotope approach to assign natal origins of California overwintering monarchs to these broad bands of the western U.S. And then this other study by Shauna Stevens and Dennis Fry, published in 2010. This is the same study that found a correlation with drought and overwintering numbers. In this study, the authors identified probable breeding grounds that produce the last generation of monarchs, based on the occurrence of late summer milkweed and thermal constraints. So these two studies have been really fantastic in furthering our understanding of some general areas where monarchs are probably reproducing in the western U.S., but there's still a need for finer scale information to guide habitat management and habitat restoration for monarchs in the West. The Xerces Society has taken on more of a crowdsourcing approach to trying to understand where monarchs are breeding in the West. A few years ago, we initiated a milkweed and monarch breeding survey in which we asked land managers, monarch enthusiasts, native plant enthusiasts, agency staff, a variety of people to record and submit their observations, primarily of milkweeds and of monarchs that were using those milkweeds to reproduce. So any monarch caterpillars, eggs, chrysalises, any adults laying eggs on milkweed, through our milkweed survey. And then as part of this project, we also compiled existing milkweed data from herbaria, the literature, any other sources we could find to begin to build a database of milkweed and monarch breeding distribution in the western U.S. And then last year, we began collaborating with the Fish and Wildlife Service using this database to build a western habitat suitability model a western monarch habitat suitability model. And this is a project led by Joe Engler of Region 1 of the Fish and Wildlife Service, working closely with Madeline Steele, Liz Cruz, Aaron Stockenberg, and others. And so this project was really driven by a recognition that geographic features, climate variability, and milkweed availability all will influence monarch habitat distribution. Understanding that milkweed and monarch data in the West is still limited. But that there was a real need with so much focus on restoring habitat for monarchs. There's a real need to identify the highest priority monarch breeding areas in order to best direct limited resources to the most appropriate areas for restoration and management. And I think there's just a real recognition that species distribution models can help quantify these relationships and help prioritize some of the most important areas and landscapes for monarch butterfly conservation in the West. So the objectives of this project were to consolidate existing milkweed and monarch records from both the Xerces database and other sources to collect new data for milkweed and monarchs, and this to date has primarily been on wildlife refuges in the Pacific Northwest, and to compile geospatial data layers of environmental covariates like climate, temperature, precipitation, distance to water, soils, things like that might influence milkweed and monarch distribution. And then the people who did the modeling used MaxEnt to create species distribution models for milkweed species as well as a model for monarch breeding in the West. And I should say this is a work in progress, and I'm just reporting and providing a snapshot of where we are in the process. So to date, 28,000 records of milkweed, monarch breeding, and monarchs have been collected, and I have the milkweed records displayed in blue here and the monarch breeding records displayed in pink. And the actual monarch records are not displayed on this map. And the highest the highest accuracy records from this data set were used with the environmental covariates to create these milkweed species distribution models. Here's an example of one species of milkweed in the species distribution model that was created. This is for showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa, which is our most broadly distributed western species of milkweed. And the dots on the map represent points of high or medium accuracy where milkweed is known to occur, or milkweed has been recorded. And the bluer the area of the map depicts the higher habitat suitability for this species of milkweed. Here's another example of a species distribution model for spider milkweed, a southwestern species. And then these milkweed species distribution models, along with models for other species of milkweed, were used with the monarch breeding records that we collected to create an overall monarch breeding species distribution model. And here's a version of that model that's projected across areas for which we have little data, especially areas of Nevada, Utah, some of the Rocky Mountain states. So this model is probably most appropriate for understanding monarch habitat suitability in California, Oregon, and Washington at this point. The next steps will be to collect and compile additional milkweed and monarch breeding data, especially from areas where data is really lacking, but also from some of the areas where we have some data already, and then to rerun these models. So for those of you who are on the call, especially if you are in some of these Intermountain West states, if you have milkweed or monarch distribution information that you'd like to contribute to this model, we would welcome that information and would really love it if you shared it. As I mentioned, we have major data gaps in the Intermountain West and Rocky Mountain West that really limit our ability to model monarch habitat suitability in those areas. And also I want to say, just given the state of our knowledge, until we understand whether or not milkweed is a limiting resource for monarchs in the West, we suspect that it's declined, but we don't know that in the western U.S. For natural areas, we recommend a strategy of identifying and appropriately managing monarch habitat in natural areas before we start planting new milkweed in these habitats. I think in other landscapes, like in gardens, urban habitats, agricultural habitats, planting milkweed is a very appropriate conservation strategy. Okay, so to address some of the data gaps that I discussed, we have initiated we're working with Idaho Department of Fish and Game and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife on a project that's been funded by a state wildlife grant to collect additional historic data on monarchs and milkweed, to launch a website that actually will be for the entire western U.S. that will provide a centralized location for citizen scientists and agency staff to report and access western milkweed occurrence data, and then to provide some short courses for citizen scientists and land managers in both Washington and Idaho. And this project is led by Beth Waterbury at the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and really has been motivated by state wildlife action plan revisions in both Idaho and Washington, and the recognition that not a lot is known about monarch and milkweed distribution in those states. To begin to fill some data gaps in the Great Basin, we're launching a project this spring with support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and with many agency partners, as well as Matt Forrester and Monarch Joint Venture, to conduct milkweed and monarch breeding surveys in the Great Basin, primarily in Nevada and eastern Utah. And we'll also be surveying land managers in western states to better understand how management practices, especially on rangelands, affect monarch habitat. And then we'll be developing a set of best management practices to recommend practices for monarch habitat enhancement in light of the multiple uses of many of our western public lands as part of this project. So in the western U.S., about half of our lands are federally managed, and we suspect that a really high proportion of monarch habitat exists on public rangelands, national forests, and other publicly managed natural areas. So there's really a huge opportunity for monarch habitat conservation on public lands in the western U.S. Okay. We're also developing technical guidance to support habitat management and habitat restoration efforts across the U.S., but including in regions of the western U.S. We've split the U.S. into about 14 regions based on some of the major ecoregions, and we're developing regional monarch nectar plant lists of plants that are monarch attractive, native to that particular region, commercially available, which is certainly an issue for a lot of native plants, hardy, probably able to establish in large-scale restorations, not weedy, since many of these plants will be used in agricultural restorations, and in bloom during the particular time of the year when monarchs are in that region. So our first two lists that we developed actually for the NRCS are available on the Natural Resources Conservation Service webpage for Southern Plains and Upper Midwest, and the lists for the Western U.S. as well as for the other regions of the Eastern U.S. will all be available this summer. So stay tuned on that project. We've also developed some technical guidance for land managers in the Western U.S., to provide some recommendations and encourage land managers to contribute to our milkweed mapping efforts. We're developing monarch and pollinator habitat assessment guidelines for refuges and other large natural landscapes currently. And through our pollinator program, we're enhancing monarch habitat in many landscapes, primarily agricultural landscapes across the U.S. And the scale of monarch habitat restoration needed is really quite large. Some estimates suggest 500,000 to 1.5 million acres per year just to replace what's been lost. And yet, native, locally appropriate milkweed has not been available in many areas of the monarch's breeding range. Or if it is available, it's only available in small quantities, and it's quite expensive. So some of our monarch habitat restoration efforts have been really motivated by a recognition that we need a large amount of milkweed. So through Project Milkweed, the Xerces Society has been working on a mass seed increase project in California, the Great Basin in the Southwest, as well as Texas and Florida. And we aim to build milkweed seed demand. We've been collaborating with many native seed companies on this work. We've also developed some seed production guidelines, and so far have worked with seed producers to bring 11 species into production of native milkweeds and developed more than 35 million seeds for species that were not previously widely available. And we've also been incorporating milkweed into our pollinator habitat restoration projects. So tens of thousands of acres of hedgerows adjacent to almond farms and tomato farms and other farms are starting to use milkweed in them. And I think milkweed is such a great plant for native bees, other beneficial wasps, and other insects, and that provides a really compelling argument for including it in agricultural habitat restoration projects. And then we've also developed a milkweed seed finder, which is a national directory of milkweed seed vendors to help restoration practitioners find locally appropriate sources of milkweed seed. So this is a place you can go to on our website, type in your region, and find a list of suppliers that supply locally native sources of milkweed seed for your projects. Okay, and lastly, I'll talk about our conservation efforts in monarch overwintering habitat in California. And there should be some time to answer questions. So as I mentioned, we've been working for many years in California on monarch overwintering habitat conservation. In the fall and winter, monarchs are found at about 300 or more coastal California groves. Currently, a few sites host more than 20,000 monarchs, and historically some have hosted more than 100,000, but only about 45 of our overwintering sites regularly have more than about 1,000 monarchs. The Xerces Society manages the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count, which is an annual monitoring effort centered around the Thanksgiving holiday, where volunteers and we have about 100 volunteers this year go out to almost 200 overwintering sites and count monarchs occupying the sites, note the location of the clusters, collect information on the habitat characteristics and habitat condition, including recording any threats to the site, delineate the boundaries of the site so that we have really accurate spatial information regarding this habitat. And I just want to bring up this graph again. I showed it earlier in the talk, but I wanted to make the point that our understanding of how monarch populations are doing at California overwintering sites is entirely through this volunteer effort, this Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count. So we've used the data that's been collected through the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count to develop a database of overwintering sites. And to develop this database, we've used information that initially came from California's Natural Heritage Program, the California Natural Diversity Database, all of our Thanksgiving counts since 1997, and a variety of other sources to get a comprehensive picture of monarch use of each overwintering site in California. And this database has been and is being used to identify conservation needs in overwintering habitats, to highlight data gaps, to prioritize sites for restoration, and to evaluate impacts of developments or other pending projects. We're frequently contacted by members of the public saying that a development is happening at a monarch overwintering site, and what do we know about it? And so this database allows us to quickly find out how significant of a site it is currently, and historically how many monarchs have reported, and as well as the location of the development relative to the site, so that we can evaluate whether the project is likely to impact the monarchs or not. And we're able to provide that information to decision makers as well as monarch advocates. We're currently developing a State of the Overwintering Sites report with support from Region 8 of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we're using this database of Western monarch overwintering site locations to identify population trends and prioritize the most important sites for restoration. After an initial analysis, we came up with some high-priority overwintering sites, and now we're working with two of the site managers in Northern California to develop a site management plan for monarch overwintering sites at these two locations. That's at Ardenwood and Lighthouse Field in Northern California. And then we've developed a set of overwintering site management guidelines for the state of California that will be published very soon, that include monarch overwintering habitat requirements and how to conduct a habitat assessment, how to develop a site-specific management plan, and as well as dealing with some very specific issues to the sites. Okay. And then lastly, we've done an analysis in collaboration with Lewis and Clark Law School and with support from the Monarch Joint Venture of the federal, state, and local laws and regulations that affect monarchs and monarch habitat in California. And really, there's not a lot of protection currently for monarchs at overwintering sites in California, but there are a patchwork of laws and regulations, some of which may provide some protection depending upon where the site is located. So with that, I'd like to say thank you again to the NCTC and the Monarch Joint Venture for inviting me to speak, as well as to Xerces Society members and supporters and the private foundations, public agencies, and corporations that provide support for our conservation work. And with that, I'd like to take any questions that people might have.
Thanks, Sarina. Before we move to the question and answer, I'm going to quickly take a little bit of time to just make some housekeeping announcements. We did record today's webinar, so that will be available on both the NCTC and the Monarch Joint Venture websites in the future. It usually happens within a week or two of the webinar itself, and we can send out a link with more details on that. We do have a March webinar in the planning phase, and all of you participating today will receive those details as soon as they become available, so you can register if you're interested and help spread the word. Look for a follow-up email from us regarding today's webinar with a quick survey for you to complete, sharing feedback you have. We'd really like to hear from you to think about how we can improve this series. So we do have about 10, 12 minutes for questions. But if we go over the allotted time, feel free to step out whenever you need to. Thanks so much for participating today. I see a few more questions are coming in on the chat box, but we will start a short question and answer period. And if we don't get to your questions, I apologize. We'll try to update the Monarch Joint Venture FAQs page with any questions that may not have been addressed. Or always feel free to refer to either the Xerces Society or the Monarch Joint Venture's websites for additional information on this topic. So, Sarina, my first question for you is in regard to the difference between Eastern and Western monarchs with the number of generations that they experience. Is the number of generations in the Western population similar to that experienced by the Eastern population? And to expand, how does the timing of these generations differ from the Eastern population?
It's my understanding that we don't know for sure how many generations we have in the Western U.S.
Okay.
So I think
and how about...
And so I think that is, I think this is really critical information that we need to... we think there are multiple generations in the Western U.S. We know... monarchs we suspect there are probably 3 generations in the Western U.S., but this life stage information and sort of where the generations, when the generations begin and where they are, we haven't worked that out for the Western U.S. as it has been worked out in the Eastern U.S., but it's really essential to understanding, population dynamics. So, it's my understanding that we don't know that.
Okay, and in terms of the timing of the migration and overwintering, could you expand a little bit on how that timing might differ? between the eastern and western populations? Not the timing of the generations per se, like the timing of the migration events. For example, eastern monarchs after August 15th tend to start their migration to Mexico.
Yeah, so we start to see monarchs showing up at overwintering sites in California in September and October, and by November, I think a lot of the monarchs are there. I think historically late November was chosen as the Thanksgiving count time period because that was thought to be the peak of overwintering site occupancy in California. But now that's actually been called into question, and some people think New Year's might be a more appropriate sort of peak time when all the monarchs are there. So peak occupancy of overwintering sites may actually be in late December, early January. And for that reason, we actually are starting to encourage people to continue counting monarchs around the Thanksgiving holiday, but also to go back to sites and count again around the New Year's holiday. But generally, mid-October to mid-February is when monarchs arrive and are at overwintering sites in California.
Great. Moving on to the next question, does site occupancy seem to change from one year to the next at the overwintering areas in the West, both in numbers of monarchs occupying those sites and different sites that may or may not be used from one year to the next?
Absolutely. Yes, site occupancy does change from year to year at individual overwintering sites, and maybe I can just flip back in my slides to show you a few of the individual overwintering sites. You can see in some years there. Let me just flip back. Can everyone still see this? In some years, you can see how counts vary from year to year. So even, in the last few years, and these are sort of older graphs, but even if the population has remained relatively stable, when we pool overwintering sites counted in California, from site to site, occupancy can change quite a bit from year to year. And we also know that at overwintering sites, monarchs are moving from site to site, and we know this from tagging work that Francis Villablanca at Monarch Alert has done.
Great. Moving on to your communication about milkweed, commercial availability of native milkweeds. Do you have more specific details or a source for more information on the species that Xerces has prioritized for increasing in the West, increasing the commercial availability of?
Yes, we do. We've got that information on our website. So if you go to xerces.org/milkweed, you can read all about the different species of milkweed that have been prioritized for seed increase.
Great. Is that also the primary website to visit for the technical guidance that you referred to throughout the presentation? There was just some interest in participants knowing how they can access some of the technical guidance that you talked about.
Yeah, I can provide a follow-up with some of that. I think xerces.org/monarchs or xerces.org/milkweed. Some of the guidance is on the milkweed site, others on xerces.org/monarch or /monarchs.
Okay. Another question based on seeds. Is collecting seeds from the wild recommended? Can you talk just a little bit about where native milkweeds are appropriate, or moving seeds across the landscape?
Yeah, so I think we recommend a pretty conservative approach in terms of collecting wild milkweed and moving seeds. We recommend that it be as local as possible within region or within reason. And I think that we need to consider different landscapes differently. So in large natural areas that probably already have a lot of monarch habitat, we may want to have a different set of practices for those habitats than we have for maybe a hedgerow in an agricultural system or an urban garden or something like that. So I guess I don't have anything more precise than that, but I think we recommend collecting milkweed seed and keeping it as local as possible.
Absolutely. I agree. This is an interesting question. Do tourism activities like monarch watching, birding, or just many people being in the general area disturb overwintering sites or the overwintering population? Yeah,
that is really interesting. That, sort of recreation management is cited as a threat to a number of our overwintering sites. I think, especially in California, a lot of these sites are popular tourist destinations, as they should be. I mean, they're pretty spectacular, and they're in this really heavily populated state that has a lot of tourism for other reasons as well. So I think that there are some impacts from visitor use to specific sites. But and that's one of the things that our overwintering site management guidelines addresses. I think that there are ways to, have people come view these clusters of monarchs in trees and maintain the integrity of the site. I mean, things like, maybe trampling nectar plant sources and things like that. So various solutions like fencing and things like that can, I think, address some of the recreation management issues that come with sites that experience high visitor use.
Sure. We have time for a few more. So could you speak a little bit more on the issue of non-native milkweeds and the prevalence of OE in the West? We've talked about this in the context of the southern U.S. with the eastern migratory population, but are interested in more thoughts from you on non-native milkweeds growing near the overwintering sites in California.
Yeah, so I guess so I explained a little bit about the research that Dara Satterfield has published about OE prevalence in the southern U.S., and I just want to say there's active research going on in California, and I don't want to, report on research that others have not published yet. But I can say that we know that there's tropical milkweed planted in many areas of California, and that there's active research to try to understand if the same concerns are valid for California. So at this point, the Xerces Society recommends planting native milkweed, in your garden. If you're going to plant milkweed, we recommend that you select a native species, that you can use our milkweed seed finder to find seed sources. You can ask at your local nursery for native species if you're interested in planting plants, because we recommend a precautionary approach at this point. And I think we should, stay tuned to this research that's ongoing, and it's coming from the Dara Satterfield at the University of Georgia in collaboration with Monarch Alert at Cal Poly.
Absolutely. And as a sort of segue follow-up to that response, maybe talk a little bit more about the citizen science opportunities, what are the current opportunities for people to get involved in some of this research in relation to tropical milkweed and parasites and larval monitoring. And there was even a question about, is there citizen science opportunity to look at impacts of eucalyptus and the overwintering groves?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of citizen science opportunities in the West, there are a number of them. There's certainly the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count, and you can go to westernmonarchcount.org to find a site to volunteer there. And as part of the Western Monarch Thanksgiving Count, we ask volunteers to evaluate habitat condition at overwintering sites. So certainly there are some opportunities to report information about site characteristics and condition. There are opportunities to monitor OE through Monarch Health, which is a citizen science project out of the University of Georgia. There are opportunities to get involved in Journey North to report sightings there. And I didn't discuss Journey North in this talk today, but it's a great resource to help us understand monarch phenology and movements, and would be just incredible if more people from the West participated in that program. There's, of course, opportunities to report occurrence data, especially milkweed occurrence and monarch breeding occurrence, to our milkweed survey, and that information will be used in the modeling project that I discussed earlier. There's also opportunities to engage in the monarch larval monitoring project through the University of Minnesota Monarch Lab, which is a great program to monitor early life stages of monarchs on milkweed patches and did I leave anything out, Wendy?
Did you mention tagging? I think that's...
And tagging opportunities. Thank you. Yes, and there are 3 major tagging programs in the western U.S. I mentioned Southwest Monarch Studies tagging in Arizona, and certainly through that program, there are tagging opportunities sort of throughout the Southwest to tag monarchs, and we can learn a lot about their movements through that program. There are tagging opportunities in California. Tags can be obtained from Monarch Alert at Cal Poly, and David James at Washington State University has a tagging program based in eastern Washington, but he also supplies tags to other areas like Idaho and Oregon, where people can tag monarchs in interior states. And I think, in the West, we would really benefit from a lot more tagging in interior Western states to better understand monarch movements in those areas. There's historically been a lot more tagging of monarchs at overwintering sites, and so we know a little bit more about where they move from overwintering sites, but we don't know as much about where monarchs are moving in the summer and fall, and especially to address these questions about, whether and how many monarchs born in western states are overwintering in Mexico versus California.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarina. I think with that we're gonna wrap it up. I apologize if we missed any of your questions in the chat box. We'll look back through the chat history and make sure that we didn't miss anything big that we should follow up with you. I know that there's a lot of information covered today, and we talked about a lot of resources that you all probably want more specifics on. So in a follow-up email with that survey for feedback, we'll try to provide some of the major links to the different programs and opportunities that we talked about in today's webinar. But with that, thank you all again for participating, and we look forward to you joining us next time.